you mentioned Nazis in Ukraine.
Mm.
I was in Odessa in 2016, and I saw them.
Mm.
We were there to, a few of us foreign journalists were invited by the mothers of those who lost their lives in the massacre in the Union Trade Hall in Odessa in 2014. I was one of 3 Americans who went, and we were there to protect the mothers who were observing the second anniversary of the massacre, because they were afraid of the Nazis who would retaliate against them.
Yeah.
And they figured, well, with an international group of journalists, filmmakers, which is what I am, they would be protected. Well, indeed, they were. But we saw them everywhere, right sector people. They threw rocks at our bus. And when you're living here in the Russian Federation, Americans will call it propaganda. There is so much hard evidence. I'm talking videos on YouTube, on Telegram, on Twitter, showing the Azov battalion and the other Nazi battalions with Nazi swastika, Nazi emblems tattooed on their bodies and patches on their arms, and Zelensky appearing with these people.
Yep.
And so, in talking about this Nazi problem, let's now shift to Canada. The scandal that happened just last week. I know you've talked a great deal about this on your own show and other places. This scandal in in Canada, has had to get the attention of the Canadian people, if nobody else. I mean, it's worldwide scandal. This is all over the world. Front page news everywhere.
Everywhere. Except Canada. Except Canada.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. Do you think that people in Canada or the United States becoming aware now of this Nazi problem? What are your thoughts?
Well, Regis, I think it's actually pretty awesome because of Nazigate in Canada. I don't think it's a coincidence that their Speaker of the House had to resign in disgrace. And within 1 week, our Speaker of the House also had to resign, basically, and was kicked out of power. And in both cases, in both of our countries, it's about Ukraine. It's about the people realizing not only is this a money pit, an endless, deep money pit, but there's also a Nazi problem, that we're actually funding and arming Nazis. The Yaroslav Hunka affair, we were live on Maverick News when it happened, because it was a big deal that Zelensky was visiting Parliament. And so on Maverick News, we had the video going live. At the time, we didn't know who he was. Just thought he was some elderly Ukrainian Canadian who was getting an honor for something. But when the speaker said that he was a hero of World War II who was fighting the Russians, I mean, that gave me pause. I said, wait a minute, hold on. I know who fought the Russians in World War II. Wait, he must have been with, the other guys, the Waffen. Turns out he was. I took that Saturday, that this happened on 2 Fridays ago. And I spent the whole day Saturday trying to find out who he was, what his background was, ran across a blog, which was basically his online memoir that Yaroslav Hunka published. And it shocked me. It really shocked me. He wrote about being a teenager growing up in this small village in Western Ukraine, not far from Lvov, and, dreaming of being in the Waffen-SS. They were heroes to those kids, They had recruitment posters in their gymnasium and in their schools, and they were trying to recruit the youth, the teenagers. So when the time came in 1943, he couldn't wait to sign up. to join the Waffen-SS. And he writes glowingly in his 2011 memoir of how proud he was of his men, of his service. He said next to nothing about the Holocaust, just danced around that completely. And even now, he's still so proud of himself. No apologies, no contrition whatsoever. And when you saw him in the Canadian Parliament, when he stood up and they're giving him 2 standing ovations, what did he do? Yeah, he gave it this. He gave his fist. He's like, yeah, we won. Like, to him, this is a great victory for Ukraine. But it isn't. He might have been a hero of Canada for a minute, but as soon as everybody figured out who he was not a hero anymore. And now the question is, what do they do about it? What do they do with him? What bothers me, Regis, is it's been 15 days now since that happened. And to date, there has still not been, proper accountability. There have not been proper apologies. There have been some kind of empty apologies and non-apologies. And then Trudeau turned around and blamed Russian disinformation for what we all saw with our own 2 eyes. What, did Vladimir Putin make that guy show up to Parliament? Did he make Justin Trudeau meet with Yaroslav Hunka in his private quarters with Zelensky? And Zelensky has not said one word about it. Not one word. Because you know how he feels about it. He probably considers the guy a hero too. But he can't say it out loud. So it's all been, kind of delicious to watch the fallout, to watch all these politicians scramble. But I'll tell you this. If every member of the Canadian Parliament really didn't know who was fighting who in World War II, as they claim, I mean, they seriously claimed not to know that he was with the bad guys. How can you not know who was fighting the Russians in World War II? Then if they're that stupid, then they should all resign because they're clearly not qualified to do their jobs and they shouldn't be in the Parliament. So I say that Justin Trudeau must resign, Chrystia Freeland must resign, and I want to see all 338 members of Parliament resign, Parliament dissolved, and elections called. Not only that, I want transparency. When Rick was on your show, he was telling you about the Duchesne Commission, which was, I think, in the 80s and early 90s. And it was supposed to be sort of their truth and reconciliation moment, but not much really came of it. As he explained to you on the show, they had some war crimes trials, but by that time, the guys were old and frail, and they basically got a pass. Canada didn't deport their Ukrainian Nazis. And, there's something else. It's important to note that at the Nuremberg trials in 1946, 1947, you notice that there were no Ukrainians prosecuted at Nuremberg. It was only Germans. The Ukrainians got a free pass and passports. And they were taken in by the British, and the CIA adopted them because they thought they'd be useful in this new Cold War that they were brewing against our former ally, the Soviet Union. And it's interesting to me how the Ukrainians totally got away with it, and yet they were some of the most brutal and savage war criminals of World War II. I mean, they did things that would make the Nazis blush. They were some of the worst, and yet they got away. Not a single one of them was prosecuted at Nuremberg. And also, as Rick explained on the show, British intelligence and the CIA essentially made Canada take all these guys because Britain didn't want them. We didn't want them. And so we said, hey, Canada, you take him. And what choice did Canada really have in the matter, right? Canada, unfortunately, has always been in a rather subservient position to the United States. And when the CIA tells you, hey, we want you to take, all these thousands of Nazi war criminals, you do. They did, whether they wanted to or not. And now they have the largest Ukrainian diaspora outside of Eastern Europe and a very powerful lobby. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. It's been around since 1940. And this organization had a lot to do with lobbying the Canadian government after the war to accept a lot of Ukrainian nationalists into the country because they are a Ukrainian nationalist organization. They have tremendous power, very close to Justin Trudeau, also to Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the so-called opposition. But they're not really opposed to each other, Regis. They're in perfect agreement. The conservatives, the liberals, they all agree that Russia is bad. Russia must be defeated. Glory to Ukraine, Slava Ukraini. And they seem to really like Nazis until they got caught. I mean, I look at the Yaroslav Hunka Nazigate scandal as a blessing in disguise. Look at the fallout just in 2 weeks' time, right? Their Speaker of the House had to resign. Their entire government is a disgrace right now, and the whole world knows it. Canadians know it. Canadians are starting to ask some hard questions of their government. Rick, my Canadian colleague there at Maverick News, he explained it very well when he said your average Canadian really doesn't know because it's just one tile in their cultural mosaic in Canada. The Ukrainian community there is large, but they tend to kind of keep to themselves. And your average Canadian had no idea about this stuff. And unlike the United States, I will say something good about my country, even though our CIA brought these guys over to the West and what they did was despicable. But at least in the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, we had a pretty good Congress in the 90s. We passed some good legislation in terms of transparency. We passed the JFK Records Act in 1992. We also passed a law in 1998 called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. And it's because of that law that we now know the whole story of what we did, what the CIA did with the Ukrainian nationalists after World War II and in the 50s and the 60s. That's a blessing. Canada needs something like that. Canada needs transparency because what Canada's been doing all these years with Ukrainian nationalists has been kept secret from their own people. And it all just blew up on the floor of Parliament 2 weeks ago. I think you couldn't have handed a bigger win to the anti-war folks like me who want this to be disclosed. And I hope that the Canadian people are not going to let this thing go. I hope they keep the pressure on their elected politicians. I hope they keep the pressure on their government. The government just wants it to go away. They want the news cycle to move on quickly. But there's still no transparency. They're still withholding documents from the Duchesne Commission. And the Canadian people have a right to know. They should demand it.
Lori, I agree. I think the mask has come off in Canada. I hope in the United States that some additional masks will come off because of this.
Me too.
That American people, in spite of that legislation, are completely unaware of Operation Paperclip and the role that these former Nazis have played throughout their government for the last 78 years. I don't know what it'll take. Is that information is certainly not being taught in schools. It's not in the history books.
Well,
But
it's
anyway,
there, Regis, but the problem is most Americans don't read.
yeah,
That's been my
and
experience anyway.
and what they call people like you and me, conspiracy nut jobs, Kremlin assets, blah 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 blah
Right.
blah.
Because we read
Lori,
history.
Lori, this has been great. Thank you so much for getting up early and coming
Thank you.
on the show.
My
I
pleasure.
hope we can. I hope we can do it again real soon. There's so many
Sure.
things that I would like to visit with you as a professional, longtime reporter, and involved in Kennedy's campaign. Although as I've said before, I don't follow this stuff on my show. I pay attention personally, but it would be really great to have you back again.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed this. I've wanted to talk to you for the longest time. We have so many friends in common. And may I just say that I pray every day for the continued safety of the people of Crimea. And I hate to see these increased attacks, increased in number and severity and frequency. I pray for you guys every day. And I hope you stay safe, you and your family.